The New Player's Guide to Drafting Magic the Gathering. Draft is quite possibly the most popular way to play Magic the Gathering. If you want to go down to your local store and play Friday Night Magic, it is highly likely that the format will be draft. So what is draft? Draft is where players select and choose cards to build a deck from, meaning that you, the player, open a booster pack and pick one card, then pass the rest of the pack to your neighbor. Your other neighbor does the same, passing you the rest of their pack. Ultimately, you and a group of 8 players open and draft from 3 booster packs each, the end goal being the construction of a 40-card deck. Since draft is so extremely popular and also very lucrative, the current process of designing Magic the Gathering sets tends to create cards, with draft as the priority of form and function. If you are drafting at Friday Night Magic at your local game store, then you are very likely drafting from the most recent set. Take a moment to familiarize yourself with the cards. Yes, there are a lot of them, and no, I am not suggesting you memorize them, but it is a good idea to take a moment to at least read over the set list. A great way to do this is simply to go to the visual spoiler provided by Wizards of the Coast. Here you can scroll through the entire set or just look at a color at a time. Read what each card does, look at everything from the artwork to the casting cost, and ensure that you are not going into your draft blind. For more advanced strategy, a great source is the Limited Resources podcast, considered by most to be the #1 source of insight into not only the strength, weaknesses, and overall effectiveness of a card, but also the go-to place for in-depth discussion and strategy for draft. Now I'm going to discuss the basics of how to identify which cards to pick and why in just a moment, but first, let's cover the actual drafting process. A pod is a group of players drafting together. This is ideally 8 people, but of course, depending on circumstance, a pod can be 6 or 10 or even 7 players. In your pod of 8 players, each player has 3 booster packs of Magic the Gathering. Each player opens the first pack, looks at each card within the pack, then chooses one card to keep. Each player then passes the rest of the cards to their left, while the player to your right hands you their remaining 14. You then repeat this process, selecting of those 14 cards you have been handed, one to keep, and then passing the 13 remaining cards to your left, while the player to your right hands you their 13 cards. You repeat this process until every card has been selected and there are no more cards left to pass. At this point, each person in the pod opens the second pack, selects a card, and passes the remaining cards to the right. Once that pack is gone, players then open the final pack, select a card, and pass to the left again. At the end of the draft, you will have 45 cards in front of you. You must then construct a deck of at least 40 cards, including basic lands. Please note, packs contain land, tokens, and sometimes foil cards. Players do not pass the land or token cards, but do pass any foil cards. Now that you know you choose the cards you want to build a deck with, the next logical question you should be asking is, how do I know which cards to pick? That's a complicated question, Billy. One that you may spend years upon years of study and practice to achieve the answer for. But let's go over the very basics. Much like in Sealed, the basic process of selecting which cards to draft is known as bread, or bombs, removal, evasion, aggro, and dirt. This is, of course, the most basic way to approach a draft. Please note, if you are currently screaming bread, you should use quadrant theory when you draft at your computer screen, then you do not need to be watching this video. Go listen to a 5-hour-long episode of Limited Resources instead. Brainiac. Let's start with the most important card to look for in your pack. Bombs. Bombs are your biggest threats. If your opponent cannot get rid of them, they will go off and win you the game. How do you know if a card is a bomb? Ask the following questions. Is this card a big creature, preferably one that is hard to block? Any big creature with evasion or perhaps abilities that makes it hard to remove is a bomb. Angel of Sanctions is a good example of a bomb. It is a big flying creature that removes one of your opponent's creatures and has embalm. Ask yourself, does this card have an effect or ability that provides you with significant card advantage? Card advantage is typically defined as a player having access to more cards than another player, usually by drawing more cards through in-game effects. However, you can achieve card advantage through causing your opponents to discard cards, and to a lesser extent simply by mass removing cards from the battlefield. So when we ask, does this card have an effect or ability to provide card advantage, we are asking, does it draw you cards, make your opponent discard cards, or perhaps make your opponent lose a huge chunk of life? Does this card provide game-breaking effects, such as that of most Planeswalkers? Usually cards such as Planeswalkers or cards with the complexity and advantage that Planeswalkers offer are clear bombs. Bombs are your first and most important priority. They are what wins games and what the rest of your deck is built around to support. Some examples of bombs are Curator of Mysteries, Archfiend of Ifnir, Regal Caracal, Glorybringer, and Honored Hydra. Removal. Removal includes counterspells, destroy, or exile effects. In other words, removal removes a threat. Your opponents will have bombs. Expect them, wait for them, be prepared to remove them with removal. Remember that removal can be so much more than simply destroy target creature. Bounce effects, or cards that read return target creature to its owner's hand, are a form of removal as well. Returning a creature to your opponent's hand can allow you to put pressure on them, and offers advantage in that they must now spend mana to recast that creature. Combat spells and tricks can be used as removal as well. Pumping your creature so that it can now block and kill an attacker is a form of removal, as is flashing in a creature strategically for surprise block and kill. Sometimes creatures have the ability to kill or bounce other creatures. These are usually high priority cards. Now, all colors get removal, but in different ways. White will typically get pacifism effects, or will be able to damage an attacker or blocker, while blue gets counters or effects like dehydration that will apply negatives to power and or toughness. Red gets direct damage, of course. Black is the color with actual creature kill. Green will get fight effects like Prey Upon. These are all ultimately forms of removal, although they do differ from one another. Some examples of removal would be Compulsory Rest, Essence Scatter, Final Reward, Electrify, and Cartouche of Strength. Evasion. Evasion means attackers being able to attack and also preventing opponents from blocking. Examples of evasion are flying, menace, trample, etc. Being able to attack without the possibility of your opponent's blocking is particularly strong. Some examples of evasion are Winged Shepherd, Aven Initiate, Blighted Bat, Pathmaker Initiate, and Lord of the Accursed. Aggro. Creatures that are neither bombs nor have evasion, but are selected to fill holes in your mana curve are aggro picks. Sometimes these are cards with weaker abilities that don't win you the game, but help you win the game. Save for dirt. Aggro is the least important card to draft, but that is not to say it is not important. Aggro, or sometimes referred to as ability cards, are often just blindly grabbed, perhaps needing to only meet the criteria of being in your colors. However, aggro should be taken with mana curve in mind. What is mana curve? You want to be able to cast a creature every turn if possible. Therefore, you want to have creatures of varying mana costs. If you were to line your creatures up by their converted mana cost, how many 1-drops would you have? 2-drops, 3-drops. Drafting aggro means drafting to fill holes in your mana curve, specifically at the lower levels. If you have no 2 or 3-drop creatures, or only one, then looking for a 2 or 3-drop aggro creature is important, especially especially if the cards you are selecting from have no bombs, removal, or evasion. Ideally, you want to fill in your mana curve to look something like this. 13 to 17 creature cards, ideally distributed between 1 to 2 and 3 to 4 mana. Again, I want to stress this is just a template. Keeping both your mana curve and creature count in mind when drafting is a vital part of a successful draft. Examples of aggro are Labyrinth Guardian, Baleful Amit, Battlefield Scavenger, Watchers of the Dead, On-Crop Crasher. And finally, we have Dirt. As the name implies, Dirt is your worst cards. Your duds. The cards you would never, ever play. Dirt tends to be all that is left in the remaining 5 or so cards. But of course, this too varies. But even Dirt or duds are not as mindless a part of draft as people think, because if possible, you should be selecting them with your sideboard in mind. Just as in other formats, you do have a sideboard in Limited. Your sideboard is all the cards you have drafted but did not use in your deck. Sometimes Dirt and duds can be situational cards that you might sideboard in between games. Classic example of this is a card that destroys an artifact or enchantment. This would rarely, if ever, be in your main board, but when grabbing Dirt, it might be a good idea, especially if you expect to go up against an opponent who may have artifacts to destroy. Some examples of Dirt are Embalmer's Tools, Gate to the Afterlife, As Foretold, Dispossess, Shadow of the Grave, and Haze of Pollen. Once again, I really want to stress this is but an introductory video. This is the absolute fundamentals of draft, the beginning of your journey. This video is not laying down any absolute rules, but rather a beginner's template from which and through which you can hopefully navigate to a better limited play experience. And in that way, I hope very much that this video has been of some help to you. If you are attending an upcoming pre-release, you won't be drafting the new set, but rather you'll be building a sealed constructed deck. Be sure to check out our video on how to build a sealed constructed deck, as well as whether or not attending pre-release is worth it. And if you did find this video helpful, you can help me out by remembering to like, share, subscribe, or just by leaving a comment. And this program was made possible thanks to a sponsorship from Card Kingdom, as well as the Patreon support of viewers such as you. So thank you.